Hey team, Dr. Jack Corty here, and in the next two videos I'm going to be covering lung diseases. Now, to really understand why lung diseases are such a problem, we need to understand how lungs work. So I'm going to give you a quick crash course on how lungs work. I've got some beautiful images here. These were actually created by researchers at the University of Tasmania, where I work, some colleagues of mine. And you can see the two main parts of the lungs. Over here you've got the foamy, spongy tissue, and over here we've got the airways that distribute the oxygen down to that foamy tissue. These are called bronchi, and the tiny branches at the end are called bronchioles. Now, a good way to think about biology in general, about organs or organelles or anything, is to think about what problem that thing is trying to solve. What problem are lungs trying to solve? It's a great way to think about biology. So let's jump into that. So here we've got a depiction of bacteria and eukaryote cells. We've got 9 bacteria and 1 eukaryote cell. But actually, once you add up all the bacteria, they have the same volume as that 1 eukaryote cell. And this is a key principle you need to understand to really get a good intuition for biological processes. You can immediately see that there is more surface area in the bacteria than there is in the eukaryote cell. So if this dark red was membrane, say it was a phospholipid membrane, you would need more membrane to encapsulate these bacteria than you would need to encapsulate this eukaryote cell, even though they have the same volume. Now, this problem is called the surface area to volume problem. And it basically states if you increase the diameter of something by a certain X amount, the surface area will go up by X squared, but the volume will go up by X cubed. So in other words, volume increases much faster as organisms get bigger than the surface area does. Now, why is that a problem to have a small surface area to volume ratio? Well, let's have a look. Here's some oxygen. Now, oxygen has to get into the cell to do cell metabolism, right? So the cell can actually, do cellular metabolism. Now, the way it gets in is mostly through diffusion. Now, diffusion is the random bumping of molecules that results in molecules moving from the high concentration down to a low concentration. Just think about peeing in the swimming pool. When you pee in the swimming pool, initially you have a high concentration of urine around you, but gradually it will diffuse away evenly throughout the swimming pool. I've got a side note fact on this. This is off topic, but it'll blow your mind. You go into this public swimming pool and you smell that smell. It's familiar. It reminds you of childhood. It's lovely. It's nostalgic, right? That smell wouldn't exist if nobody peed in the pool. It's formed from a reaction of urea and the chlorine in the pool. So if there was no urea in the pool, there would be none of that lovely smell of a public swimming pool. So I'll probably just ruin that for you. Mark Rober has a fantastic video on it if you want to YouTube it and dive into it, especially if you don't believe me. I bet you don't believe me, but it's true, unfortunately. Anyway, I'm getting distracted. Okay, back to the oxygen. Now, what if the oxygen wants to get into the eukaryote cell? To get into the middle of the eukaryote cell, it has to diffuse a long way, and that's a long way for something so gradual. Go back to the swimming pool idea. The urine doesn't immediately dissipate from around you. It takes some time to drift out and equally spread across the pool. So it takes time for that oxygen to get into the cell. Now, fortunately for eukaryote cells and bacteria, that time is negligible because at this scale, oxygen is moving at about 10 meters per second, which is incredibly fast. It means it could travel the distance of a cell about 1 million times a second. So oxygen getting into a eukaryote cell is not a problem through diffusion. When it starts to get a problem is when we start to evolve from things like a worm out to a human. Now, a worm is a hollow tube, so that's got a high surface area, and it's skinny and long, so that's got a high surface area. If a worm was a sphere, it would have a low surface area to volume ratio. But because it's long and skinny, we've got extra surface area for that volume. So the oxygen diffusing, or any nutrients, glucose, anything diffusing from outside the worm through the mucous membranes down into the muscles of the worm, for example, it's a small distance to travel and it's not really a problem. However, if you're a human, getting oxygen from outside the brain, for example, through the skin, through the skull, down into the brain, is not going to happen fast enough. The diffusion distance is too long, and so the time it would take for oxygen to get down into your neurons will have died. Who is this, you ask? This person is at Jack Orty on Twitter. So he's an imposter. He's stolen me. And so now when I Google my name, he pops up. So he's going to end up in my PowerPoint slides there. He's got a big brain though, so he shouldn't feel too bad. Yeah, so this is the problem lungs are trying to solve. The problem lungs are trying to solve is diffusion distance, right? There is too great a diffusion distance in large complex organisms because their volume increased by the cube, but the surface area only increased by the square. So we don't have a lot of surface area to absorb oxygen, and the diffusion distance between the skin and the deep organs is too large. It would take too long given the metabolic demands that we have. So lungs need to solve this problem. So here we have a human being. Now let's imagine that this person's lungs are just a giant air sac, right? Just maybe even like a Swiss ball, an exercise ball, just a big hollow sac in their chest. Now, we run a blood vessel along the side there, and the goal is to get the oxygen to the red blood cells because the red blood cells transport oxygen around our body. Now, what you can see is, yes, there'd be some oxygen close to the surface of the blood vessel, but there would still be some oxygen that has a massive diffusion distance to get from the center of the Swiss ball out to the blood vessel. There's also really low surface area to volume ratio, so you cannot fit a lot of blood vessels up against the Swiss ball. So what you need is to increase your surface area to volume ratio, and they do this through these tiny, tiny little exercise ball-like things called alveoli, these small air sacs that massively increase the surface area. That's what creates the spongy, porous nature of the lungs. And each one of these little circles looks something like this, and you can see that there's a massive surface area to volume ratio here, allowing all the oxygen to travel a very tiny diffusion distance across these 3 or 4 membranes to get from inside the alveoli out into the blood cells and to around the body. So by having these tiny sacs all throughout the body, you've massively increased your surface area to volume ratio all throughout the lungs, sorry, I should say, not body. You've massively increased your surface area to volume ratio, which allows you to have way more surface area to do these things like gas exchange. And you've also decrease that diffusion distance massively. So now you've just got this tiny diffusion distance. Now, remember, importantly, I've been talking about oxygen getting in, but also CO2 needs to get out. So we need that gas exchange to occur at the surface. Now, diffusion is great, but don't you still have to get an oxygen to diffuse down your trachea, through your bronchi, through your bronchioles, to the alveoli? Haven't you still got a very long diffusion distance? Well, the answer is the body solves that again by bulk flow, by pumping air in and out using a muscle, and that muscle is the diaphragm. It basically sits, imagine, concave under your ribs, and by contracting it comes down, and that creates negative pressure, essentially sucking air in. We also have ribs, muscles in between our ribs called intercostal muscles that help to expand our rib cage, again increasing this volume, dropping the pressure and sucking air down. Now it's almost exactly like a syringe, right? So here we have a syringe, you pull that down, which is like the diaphragm, you pull that down, you create negative pressure, sucking air in. And so now we've got active bulk flow, so it's not diffusion, it's bulk flow, and then we've got a very small diffusion distance once it's in across the alveoli into the blood vessels, and we've got huge surface area because of all of these tiny little balls, which massively increases your surface area, those alveoli. So yes, you pull the plunger down, which is just like pulling your diaphragm down. Getting winded is stunning, that diaphragm. So the first rugby try I ever scored, I was like 7 years old. I jumped and I landed on the ball there, and that was my first time getting winded, and I thought I was going to die. That was it. That's the end of my life. But it stuns the diaphragm, so you can't pull it down for a wee while, and it just takes a wee while to get back going. Oh boy, flashbacks to that. All right, now we know how the lungs work. In the next video, I'm going to jump into lung inflammation and disease. Thanks, team.